Deroju to come forward to share her knowledge and ideas with all the participants. Hello?
Thank you for the generous introduction, sir.
Thank
Good
you.
morning to all of you. I take this opportunity to thank the director of the college, director of PARVATHY'S Arts and Science College. Thank you for this opportunity, sir. I also thank the principal for his generous words and his welcome. Thanks to the vice principal too, who had contributed a lot. There are a few points I think I'll talk in parallel with his address as he felicitated the audience. I also take this opportunity to thank Dr. Anandan, the head of the department. Thanks for all the faculties of the Department of English who are here. And thanks to all the HODs who are assembled here. Thanks to the students also and all those who are watching this live. So, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. Your voice is clear.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I think with these few words, I should go to my presentation. So before which, the title of my presentation is Pandemic Literature, a Discourse of Survival. So standing right in the middle of the eye of the storm, I think this is the right time for us to have something like this. I think the Department of English of the college has grabbed this opportunity and all of us have gathered here. And I hope the idea of survival will make a lot of sense in this particular juncture. So I think I'll move on to my presentation. Yes, ma'am. So I think my presentation is now visible to everyone. If I have a yes, I think I'll continue. Can anyone of you acknowledge?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thanks, ma'am. Thanks, ma'am. Right. So the title of my presentation is Pandemic Literature, a Discourse of Survival. So with a small introduction to what pandemic is and pandemic literature is, I think I'll begin my presentation. Pandemic literature, I think the definition is very, very generic. I think most of us know what pandemic literature is. But I think the definition will save us a lot of explanation later. So, a pandemic is defined as an epidemic occurring worldwide or over a very wide area, crossing international boundaries and usually affecting a large number of people. So, pandemic certainly involves the society.
Presentation is not audible, ma'am.
Madam, you are not audible, ma'am. Madam, you are not audible, ma'am.
Madam, your voice is not audible. There is an error. Hello?
Ma'am, Pamela Jayaraju. Ma'am, you are not audible, ma'am.
Dr. Anandan, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible now.
Yes, ma'am. Now you are audible.
Okay, there was a connectivity problem. I've connected once again. So I think I will continue. So the pandemic, as I started, the pandemic definition is an epidemic occurring worldwide. Of course, we have this epidemic, pandemic, and something called endemic. I'm sure all of us know what it is. So crossing international boundaries, this particular malady seems to have affected everyone globally. It's not just affecting a major part of the population, but it's affecting all of us. So all of us are somehow exposed to this virus, and we are really worried. But despite that, life goes on, and that is what we are here to discuss. Now, what is pandemic literature? Pandemic literature is any written work of art that expresses the horror of pandemic and its aftermath. So the horror of pandemic can be explained. There are many kinds of horrors it can be explained. But the horror of pandemic, along with its aftermath, is what is most important for us. There are physical maladies, psychological issues, and social issues come together along with the pandemic. As witnessed by the society, is called pandemic literature. Hence, we are not today going to take a look at a few works of art that have pandemic and the aftermath of pandemic as their mainstay. So we especially have a first-hand idea of what pandemic is. Just 1 year back, I think everyone who read pandemic literature were listening to or looking at and reading recorded events, recorded incidents. It was second-hand knowledge, but I think all of us now have a first-hand knowledge of what pandemic does and what it has done. So all around us, it has wreaked havoc, and we are still struggling, grappling with methods to stall its effect on us. Now, I think we as a group, we are the contemporaries who have better knowledge of pandemic, and also we will be the first kind of survivors with a thorough knowledge of pandemic. So with these words, I think we'll move on. So pandemic is not new to the world. Of course, it is certainly not new to literature. Pandemic is also not new to the world. Pandemics that struck the world are many in number. There is a small list. It's a very small list. Of course, we can add a lot to that. The Great Plague of Marseille, the French plague, the first cholera pandemic of 1817, 1824, the flu pandemic of 1889, 1890. We have quite an amount of quite an amount of excuse me. Records about the flu pandemic of 1889 to 1890. Look at the range, the dates. So all of them have all of them have run their course for 2 years. So this is one thing that we have to remember. Next comes the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1920, which finds a lot of records we can find of the Spanish flu in the Spanish flu in literature. Next, we have the coronavirus pandemic of 2019 to 21. So, what is special about all these things is one important fact is that all of them seem to have run their course for at least 2 years. So, medicos and scientists have kind of found out, and they assume that the coronavirus pandemic that began in 2019 would have run its course by 2021. So this is the most hopeful of the news that we have received so far. And when we look at the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, we have something that we have to remember. An interesting thing. The word Spanish flu is in itself a misnomer, because the Spanish flu has nothing to do with Spain. The Spanish flu actually originated in the US mainland, and while the World War was going on, the entire world was looking up for news about. Please excuse me. 1 minute. 1 minute, please. So the Spanish flu of the 1918 to 1920 has got a name in a different way. Spain had nothing to do with this flu. Actually, the countries at war were very busy with the war as well as the flu that was raging in all those countries. And Spain actually had taken a center stand, and what happened was Spanish media was giving out all the news in its truth, and all the other countries that were involved in the war had maintained a kind of media blackout. So the entire world, as well as the citizens of the countries that were busy in the war, looked up to Spain for news. So once Spanish news, the media started giving all kinds of information, it was most useful for all of them. And Spain was so true to itself that it gave out all the news in truth. And at one point of time, the entire world started believing that the flu originated in Spain. Hence the name Spanish flu. So this is actually called stigmatizing. So naming a particular nation, naming a particular country or a group of people to have been responsible for the flu. So this kind of stigmatization was most prevalent, and even during the Spanish flu in 1980, from 1918 to 1920, you have this problem. So the condition is the same even now. So now we have this coronavirus pandemic, and the ground zero of this this pandemic was totally was China. But of course, name calling the Chinese, name calling the country, calling it the Chinese flu or the Wuhan flu was not right. but actually the Spanish flu had its origins in the US mainland, which means America was it was America that was ground zero. So this kind of misunderstanding and misrepresentations were prevalent in history, and even now I think this problem still continues. Actually, who is in charge of naming the viruses is the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses, the ICTV. But despite this, and despite all the virologists and the wider scientific community, we have people in power name-calling countries, name-calling races. In fact, even people of Asiatic descent were called as, were blamed to have spread the virus. So this is the kind of world that we live in, despite all the developments, scientific as well as in all other fields. Now, moving on to the next point, the pandemic and the war were closely associated. So I'm talking about the previous pandemic, the Spanish flu and the World War. So the World War ran its course from 1914 to 1918, and the war and the pandemic coincided with it. So they have kind of complemented each other. We can say they have complemented each other. So on the one hand, you have war, on the other hand, it was the pandemic that was wreaking havoc in the countries, not just a few countries, but the worldwide. The first recorded case was from the American army camps. So the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920 started in the American army camps, and it spread throughout the world, and its spread was directly linked to the transportation of the troops. So once the troops, the soldiers were transported from one place to another, the flu spread very quickly, and the statistics say that more soldiers died because of the Spanish flu than because of the war. And globally, more number of people died because of the Spanish flu than because of the World War. So this losing of lives and the pandemic are closely associated, and not the generation that came before or us we are able to stall its effect on humanity. Another important thing during the Spanish flu, I think that continues even today, is the misrepresentation in numbers. The reported numbers are very different from the actual fatalities. So the estimated fatality rate was more than 100 million globally in the Spanish flu, but actually what was said through the media was the death rate was 2.5 million. So that was how media misrepresented, hid to camouflage the facts, and so many other things. So the power structures wanted to keep so many important things at bay, especially the truths, that they did not mind giving out falsities, false informations. So that has often been the case even now. I think there has been lots of problems. Not in the beginning, initial stages of the outbreak of the virus, maybe the entire human society did not have a complete, thorough idea, or the entire truth was not told to them. So much was hidden. I think very later, when things went out of control, people and the media did a lot of help by giving out what was a real problem. Right. So the Spanish, if we talk about the Spanish flu, the ground zero for Spanish flu was US mainland, while the ground zero for the present coronavirus pandemic is China, the Wuhan district of China. Now, what does the war do? What does the pandemic do? While we talk about war and the pandemic, we have to talk about the scientists, the medicos. So when we talk about the scientists, they provide us with the medical knowledge, which is most important. They give us truths about the medical aspects behind this pandemic problem. Now, so the scientists and the fictionists are totally diverse in their discursive methods. While scientists give us medical knowledge, the fictionists have tried to interpret it in a very different way so that they can fit into the literary genres. Their varying responses to the common predicament is complementary. Scientists respond in a different way, while fictionists respond in a different way. The medicos struggle to understand the unknown and neutralize its effect on humanity. So scientists keep a record of the patients. They keep the patients under observation. They try to study the patient and come up with some kind of understanding of the virus. So there, before solution, they try to understand the virus. When it comes to the fictionists or the writers, they try to understand the virus from the point of view of the medicos and try to produce a literary work out of the entire thing. Now, writers fictionalize the suffering and pain and attain a considerable level of emotional distancing, while scientists are also emotionally distanced from the effects of virus. They struggle to find a solution. But fictionists or writers seem to present to the society their point of view, of course, fiction as well as facts put together. They try to provide their point of view to the society. Of course, there is also emotional distancing. So the act of writing itself helped in emotional distancing oneself. It can be the writer, it can be the scientist on the other hand when it comes to medical knowledge. Of course, when it comes to the reader, it's a kind of, the reader is also able to read it, understand it, but at the same time stay emotionally distanced from the tragedy that he is reading from the text. So this loss that the reader suffers and the post-trauma that the reader suffers is kept within a personal domain. So the reader is able to read it in a very objective manner. That's what the writers do. So this is where the writers come helping the reader. While the scientists help the readers with solutions, while the scientists help the common man with solutions, cures, the writers try to help the common man distance himself, but at the same time, take a look at the tragedy and the pain from a closer perspective. So hence the reader is encouraged to deliberate over the ordeal in an objective way. So the ordeal is very close to the reader, but at the same time the reader can easily keep himself away from it, because the action exactly or the suffering exactly is not his. It belongs to the character, it belongs to the protagonist or someone inside the novel. So this way, it was a kind of therapy for the reader. So writing or pandemic literature provides a kind of therapy, and the discourse that is able to communicate to us a kind of psychological therapy to the reader. Right. Moving on. Hence, pandemic literature is actually made up of medical knowledge, the writer's ability, as well as other factors which have contributed to the pandemic. Of course, when we talk about the Spanish flu and all this stuff, we also talk about the world wars and all the other things that have put together. Of course, industrial revolution at one point of time had a lot to contribute to pandemic literature. Not just that, we also have new theories coming up. We also have the feminist struggle coming up. We have the diaspora struggle coming up. So all this at one point of time, pandemics and the post-colonial situation was also very much alive at one point of time. So all of them can be looked at from different perspectives. Now, coming to the next point, the corpus of pandemic literature is made up of not just stories or anything, but humanity's exposure to illness. So the first point is the humanity's exposure to illness. So so that makes up the basis of pandemic literature. Of course, biomedical investigations. If it is just illness and a human being writing about it, it will be just pain and suffering and sorrow. But biomedical investigations give us hope. Biomedical investigations give us escape routes from these maladies, these pandemics. and the survivor's reactions is most important. So you can have a problem, you can also have solutions. Unless you have a survivor who is going to report it to you, you will not know what happened. So the survivor's reactions makes up the important part of the pandemic literature. So that's our title. So survivor's account of what happened is what is going to help us talk and deliberate what is going to be presented today. So the survivor can be the victim, or the survivor can be someone who was unaffected by the contagion. And of course, it is not just being affected and relieved of the problem and then, as a survivor's account presenting it. There is also the biomedical dilemma. Also, the biomedical groups, the departments have had a dilemma. Should I find can I find a cure for this? Will I be able to restore this person back to life? And there is also this ethical dilemma. So ethical dilemma is what we have been seeing now. We as living in the current scenario, in the pandemic scenario, we are able to look at all the ethical questions. So many people died. There have not been enough medications. There are no beds, less number of oxygen, supply. And of course, there are a lot of other casualties, fire in the hospital, and this kind of problems have all made up an ethical dilemma in the minds of the people living amidst the pandemic situation. Of course, when it comes to the government officials, when it comes to the people in power, there is a lot of ethical dilemma. Should I help? Should I take this step, or should I not? Of course, should the lockdown issue that we are now seeing. So, has the lockdown been of any use apart from stalling the spread of the upsetting the contagion? Has it been of any use? There are differing viewpoints. So while some say that the lockdown has been very useful, there are other set of people who have said it has brought the economy down. I think when the vice principal in his felicitation, he did say that the economy has gone to the very foundations. There's been a lot of question mark about what is going to happen. The financial condition, the economic status of an individual, the economic status of entire states have come into question. So there's been a lot of ethical dilemma in the case of this coronavirus pandemic, and all of them have been addressed. All of them are being addressed, and of course, refractory outbreaks of virus, comorbidity as an important aspect. So when we look at some of these pandemic literatures, very recent ones, apart from the epidemic that strikes the person, the comorbidity, the patients are also warned about the comorbidity, any other complication that arises out of it. We have this Black Death and the black fungus that was doing the rounds in all the coronavirus patients. At the same time, this kind of new elements were possible, new elements cropped up, medical conditions cropped up in the Spanish flu season also. So all these things make up the corpus of pandemic literature. Bioterrorist attacks, of course, these are more bioterrorist attacks are possible because a lot of research has been done. But of course, the scientists as well as the defense department is war ready for any kind of bioterrorist attacks. Many movies have come up with this bioterrorist attack as its in its crux. So the corpus of pandemic literature is made up of all of this. So when I say pandemic, I'm not talking just about the pandemic. There have been different kinds of pandemic. I think in one of the slides we took a look at many different kinds of pandemics. These few things that I will now tell can also be included in that. The rabies was also epidemic or kind of pandemic because rabies is prevalent in almost all the places in the world. The AIDS pandemic beginning in 1980, the AIDS pandemic has not come to an end. There's no closure. Scientists expected a closure, but a closure is not nowhere near the horizon. The Ebola virus, the Zika virus, the Nipah, all these things are different methods, different ways in which the pandemic and these diseases exhibit themselves in the society. Polio is also one of the epidemics that caused a lot of havoc. Cholera is one another. And much globally, the death rate due to cholera was also very high. That has also been fictionalized, and you also have non-fiction pandemic literature. All of them have been recorded in those books too. So these are the things that make up the corpus of pandemic literature, and let's move on to what we have next. So what do these discourses do? These discourses have much to contribute. They shape much to contribute to the society as well as to the reader, not just a reader of literature, but also to anyone who comes in contact with it. These discourses shape attitudes towards emergence of the disease and social transformation. These diseases don't stand alone. They just don't affect a single person. They bring about a social transformation, for the good or the bad. So the social transformation that has come up has all been recorded in the works of art. These discourses lead to effective, compassionate, and just responses to problem of global health and welfare. So while the global health and welfare was an important question that had to be answered in a continuous way, the pandemic situation has made it very imminent that answers to many problems have to be found. These communicable diseases and social interaction is another important aspect. So the flus of the past, all the flus of the past have had one thing in common, that is social distancing. Because they affect entire societies, they affect the entire world. They just don't affect a particular person. Hence, social interaction, which is most important, is the one that comes under attack. So these communicable diseases have attacked the social interaction that is the basis of human life, and they lead to fears and anxieties and consequently an alteration of lifestyle. So lifestyle alteration of the citizens during the Spanish flu may not be very clear, may not have been recorded that minutely, but lifestyle alteration of a pandemic scenario is very clear to all of us now, because we live in the middle of it. We are living in the middle of it. And what are the changes that we have done to our lives? What are the transformations that have happened automatically to our lifestyle is what we are now seeing. Technically, the scientist based is, when we talk about these discourses, the scientist based his observation on the patient's illness and then his findings, and the novelist interprets the epidemiological scenario. So this is how these discourses are formed. So these discourses have medical knowledge and literary expertise at its foundation, and they try to provide some message to the society. Now, moving on. There are more discourses and strategies in connection with pandemic literature. We have illness narrative, outbreak narrative. They overlap, but at the same time, of course, you have slightly different examples for all of them. And you have disability narratives. That is also part of pandemic literature. Trauma discourse. So one's response to trauma of different kinds. So now that the entire world has been traumatized by the coronavirus pandemic, and this trauma, as recorded in the literary works, form the trauma discourse. Now we also have lockdown literature, and actually all of them are called pathographies. Pathography is pathology, and then combined with writing, they are called pathographies. Now, what is most important is these kinds of discourses are going to have more number of examples. They are going to find a lot of contributions in a short while, because all these narratives have been read as part of literature, part of a literature class, but now all of them have become so live and all of them have become so true in the real life that we are going to have contributions from all walks of life. And how have all these narratives changed shape according to the present pandemic is also a point in question. Of course, all this is just the tip of an iceberg. There is much to be discussed, or there is much that can be done in the field of pandemic literature. Now, as I move on to pandemic fiction, I would like to say, where does plague or where does illness come? René Girard, in his 1974 essay, The Plague in Literature and Myth, says, a plague is found everywhere in literature. So, if plague is found everywhere in literature, there is no particular genre of literature that is going to talk about plague. So, every kind of literature is going to talk about plague. So, we now first take a look at fiction. And when we talk about fiction, you have pandemic fiction, you have non-fiction about pandemic. So they all form part of pandemic literature. Now, pandemic fiction is not a new introduction. Pandemic fiction is quite ancient. You have Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad also provides ideas about this pandemic, the flu that affected his days, the days of the ancient Greeks, and the best of them is Boccaccio's Decameron. So Boccaccio's Decameron has provided a lot of insight into what the pandemic flu does. So Boccaccio's Decameron of 1353 speaks about the Black Death. So, so here it has been quite often quoted. So Boccaccio's Decameron has a group of 10 people, young men and women. All of them self-isolate themselves when they are affected by the Black Death. So they go to a castle outside Florence. They all live there in self-isolation for a particular period of time. While they are there, to while away the time, to keep them away from the tragedy of the outside world, they exchange stories. So they tell stories to each other for survival. So this kind of storytelling helped them keep keep themselves, keep their minds free of the tragedy that was ravaging the city of Florence. So what kind of stories did they say? They spoke about, they told tragedies, they told stories of tragedies, they told stories of love, they told stories of valor, criticism, comedy, a lot of political criticism. So all these things were possible for this group of young people in Decameron by Boccaccio. So Decameron is one initial text where the initial stages of literary criticism, a bold one, was set up. Now, next we can want to move. Mary Shelley's The Last Man. So, as the title goes, it's about it's a kind of apocalyptic fiction. She envisions a futuristic Britain where one last man survives. It's more about man, animal living together, cohabiting, and also the power of friendship. So Mary Shelley's The Last Man was later made into a movie. So Mary Shelley has also contributed to this, talks about the strength of friendship. So next we can move on to Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. As the title goes, Poe talks about the Red Death that ravaged the cities, and how human beings respond to plague is the main question that has been answered by Edgar Allan Poe. So the Mask of the Red Death. So I think we remember the masks that were worn by the characters in the plays, the morality plays. So the masks, which stand as a symbol for Red Death. So post this particular novel work explains how human beings respond to plague. Camus' The Plague is one important turning point writing from 1942. So Camus' Plague talks about the isolation and the failure of states to respond to human mortality. So it's a kind of critique. So Camus was able to critique the governments, the power structures. And Stephen King's The Stand is also another important novel. He written even in the 1978. It's a huge text, but at the same time very important. Very interesting read to Stephen King's. Stephen King's The Stand talks about a particular viral outbreak. So this contagion outbreak is the characters find it very difficult to stall this contagion outbreak, and it's total chaos till the end of Stephen King's novel. But in fact, Stephen King, in one of his recent tweets in the month of March 2020, says, COVID is not as unmanageable as the flu in my stand. So please stay safe and stay secure, says Stephen King. So The Stand is another novel. It's a very good read. Moving on to to Joe Saramago's Blindness. So once again, Blindness is a novel, as the title goes. People become blind. It's a kind of plague. It's a kind of epidemic that affects the people of a particular area. So they slowly find out that they are unable to see their shadows, or their shadows disappear, and next blindness sets in. So this is also a kind of apocalyptic novel of from 1999, and Station 11 is another novel which talks about by Emily St. John Mandel in 2015, and this talks about the how art matters as helpful in the crisis, during crisis. So these are the novels that form pandemic fiction. These are a few novels that I thought I can tell you. So pandemic fiction, there are other novels to buy. I think many of you will be familiar with Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 2017 novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. While the cholera epidemic rages, the love life goes on. All these novels explain to us in a very subtle way that while death and suffering was an integral part of an entire society that lived during the pandemic, love and life did go on. It's mainly because of those survivors and because of human resilience that life goes on. We move on to Charles Whelan's 2019 novel, and Charles Whelan's novel and Ling Ma's novel of 2019, The Rationing and Severance, are actually satires. One is a political satire and the other one a social satire. The Rationing. So Whelan actually criticizes the governments for limiting for the media blackout. So the government is not giving to the citizens the true facts, the true data about the pandemics or the epidemic, and the people are confused. So Whelan criticizes that. Severance is once again a social satire, Lingma attacks capitalism and consumerism in Severance. So capitalism and consumerism is also a kind of plague. So there are two kinds of plagues. One is the medical plague that we talk about, plague, pandemic, contagion, and all that. At the same time, there are other kinds of novelists, other kind of writers who call consumerism, capitalism, and other social maladies too as plagues. They also form part of the plagues, the pandemics, and ravage the society. And those writers believe that kind of epidemic should also be weeded away. So, of course, my list is a mixture of all those things. And we have the Book of Yum novel, and we have Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay. So all these things together, Rebecca Mackay talks about AIDS epidemic. The AIDS epidemic that has still not left the world. It's still there. It's dormant, or maybe not dormant exactly, but I think other epidemics, other problems have come up that the AIDS epidemic is still at large in the society, but there is a kind of silence. That's how we can put it. The most recent of pandemic fiction is Lawrence Wright's The End of October and Mike Chen's A Beginning at the End. So these two novels are very special. That's why they have been put separately, because if you look at the next slide, The Beginning at the End was published in January 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, and The End of October by Lawrence Wright was published in April 2020. So Mike Chen's novel is a post-apocalyptic suspense thriller. While Lawrence Wright's is where you find an epidemiologist who is at the center of action. He is the hero. So this epidemiologist tries to rescue people, tries to find a solution for the pandemic or the plague that strikes the society, and that is End of October for you. So these two novels are very recent and may make very good reads. And moving on to pandemic literatures as a non-fiction, we have a lot of texts. I'm just looking at a few texts. Right. We have the Journal of the Plague Year. One thing we have to remember about non-fiction is most of them are autobiographies. Some of them are biographies. And some of them have facts recorded. They kind of form a thorough study based on societal changes or changes in the medical field of medicines, and then these books have been written. Now, looking at the small list, the humble list, The Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe is the best. Daniel Defoe's information comes from his uncle who was alive during the pandemic. So during the plague, he was alive, and he seems to have given a lot of information to Daniel Defoe. In fact, Daniel Defoe tries to bring in a kind of reality. He tries to depict the same names of the streets, names of districts, names of areas, and also names of some characters in his the Journal of the Plague Year. So as the title goes, it's a kind of journal. It's a kind of record that Daniel Defoe was able to assemble with the help of first-hand information that he gets from the Plague Year. Now, moving on to Catherine Ann Porter's 1937 novel, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, is a kind of autobiography. Catherine Ann Porter was affected by the Spanish flu. She was a victim. So it was a near-death experience for Porter. And when she came out of when she was saved, when she came out of this flu attack, she found out that she had gone bald and all that, lot of changes, and she later finds out that her hair that grew back was white in color. So the title probably Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Catherine Ann Porter was never able to change the color of the hair because it grew. The natural color that it took was almost white. So that is it. So Catherine Ann Porter's writing was a first-hand experience. Now John Kelly's The Great Mortality is another good read. Crosby's 2007 The American Plague is so frighteningly similar to what we are going through now. The American Plague by Crosby is an excellent read. And this book, if we read this book, we will understand that not much is different from the American Plague and what is happening now. So Crosby describes in his book that the plague was an era of masks. So the mask that we wear. So the American Plague was an era of masks, Crosby says. And he also says many things that are so similar to what is happening now. So he says schools were closed, theaters were closed, playhouses were closed, and what was the government understood that the first culprit to the spread of disease was transportation. So Crosby says transportation was the most important aspect that spread the diseases, and so transportation was banned. And indigenous people tried to safeguard, cordon off their area by taking turns guarding the areas, so that no other person from the outside world will enter into their areas and contaminate the area and the people too. And Crosby also talks about how inns or motels where people used to stay, people were not permitted from then on to write their names or address. They made entries in a book, log book, so that they know who was staying. But because handling the pens or the diaries, the log books can be the cause of contamination, those log books were kind of suspended. So all these things together make up the American plague. American plague is another important thing that we can find a lot of similarities. And social distancing was another important aspect of American plague. So everyone kept a distance. People tried to avoid hospitals and all that. I think the one biggest difference from American plague and the incidents that Crosby describes that happened during the plague in America is the online classes. Online classes, okay, it's a new introduction. Otherwise, the American plague is frighteningly similar to what is happening now. The case is the same. The problem is the same. We have a pandemic. There was a plague. People suffered. It was global in its in making its vicious mark, and not a single person was spared. There is also this. So the American plague brings into question this one aspect. Is there a difference? Difference in social strata, difference in economic strata, or any other differences were overruled? The patron as well as the protege, they were affected. The master as well as the slave was affected. There was absolutely no difference. The privileged as well as the underprivileged were affected. So that's the case in today's world also. So the American plague gives a very clear picture of what a plague or an outbreak of contagion can do. So Crosby is a great read. Now moving on to spillover animal infections, the next human pandemic. David Quammen in 2013 undertook a long and arduous effort to make a record of all animal infections possible in the world. He traveled to many places and gathered data, and then was his founding was the spillover. Spillover is actually a zoonotic text. So zoonotic infections have been discussed in spillover, animal infections. So this is actually, and David Quammen in this particular text had foreseen the next human pandemic. He had almost predicted the next human pandemic that can take place in this, and he also predicted that it can have its origin in animals. So he had traveled all over the world to find the origins or possibilities of pandemics and plagues and any kind of virus. Right. So these are the non-fiction and fiction pandemic literatures. Moving on, pandemic idea, the concept did not just get into writing fiction and non-fiction, but it was also found in other methods of art. So the theater and the contagion, they make up a great pair. So the theater of the then days, today's theater is totally different. It is kind of e-theaters these days. But those theaters were very physical, and the physical closeness was the one that spread the contagion, and contagion had its heyday mainly because of the physical proximity. Now, the theaters of those times and the contagion, they had a very complicated relationship, or they had a very tumultuous relationship, if I can put it that way. On the one side, theater practice was fueled by subjects like contagion, outbreaks, illness, pandemics. And on the other hand, as soon as a pandemic infection set in, theaters had to be closed. So this provided a very interesting combination. And theaters were fueled by pandemics, and they were also stalled by pandemics. Now, what are the kinds of theatrical expressions of pandemics? Maybe if you can take a look at them and also see how survival was a part of those discourses, theatric discourses. So, the Greek theater provided ample space for pandemic or epidemics. In fact, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, it's a play that the play opens with an outbreak narrative. The first line of the play is, "The god of plagues and fire raids like lightning." So Sophocles' play starts with this line that has so much to do with an outbreak narrative. So, and we also have Euripides' Hippolytus, that also has incidences of the plague. Then Elizabethan and Jacobean theater also provided lots of arena for mention of plagues and contagions. Moving on to Shakespeare theater, maybe a few points of this particular theater can be of great use to students of literature. So Shakespeare's theater found a lot of multiple mentions of the contagion in different ways. And when we look at, in fact, in The Tempest, we find Prospero cursing Caliban with an attack of red plague. He curses that Caliban is affected or afflicted by the red plague. So that's from The Tempest. And King Lear, at one point of time in his senility, calls his daughter, one of his daughters, plague sore. He calls his daughter plague sore. Probably, I think that's gonorrhea. I think students should be able to tell it and they have a better idea. So King Lear calls one of his daughters plague sore. And Lady Macbeth's obsession with washing her hands, washing the damn spot, I quote from Macbeth. Lady Macbeth keeps, in an obsessive way, washing her hands and calls it the damn spot that has to be washed. So this obsession with washing hands could be a an echo of cleansing exercises during the play. And in fact, another important aspect is Romeo and Juliet's tragedy could have been averted if only the Franciscan friar who was supposed to deliver a letter to one of the lovers, he is quarantined because of a kind of infectious disease, probably some kind of infection. So if not for that infection and if not for that him being quarantined, he could have handed over the letter to one of the lovers, and of course the lovers could have met, misunderstandings could have been avoided, and the tragedy could have been averted. So this is how Shakespearean theatre made several mentions of the play. Of course, we have Chekhov's Uncle Vanya of 1897, referred to the typhus outbreak, the then typhus outbreak, and Ibsen's Ghost of 1881 talks about syphilis plague. So syphilis was considered plague. Syphilis was was a kind of plague. It was a contagion, and that was most specific at that particular time of Ibsen's playwriting. So it was a taboo. It was usually not spoken, but Ibsen took the initiative, and he was first of his kind to talk about that in an open playhouse. So the 20th century theaters found exhibition of the idea of HIV and AIDS in them. Many plays found place for an expression of this particular malady that was most prevalent at that time in the 20th century, during the 20th century. And this communication dynamics, the theater and the contagion was so good that was so effective that theaters also found, in theaters also we find references of pandemic and plague. Now, pandemic narratives and indigenous writers. So when I spoke at another point about pandemic narratives and indigenous writers, we have to remember that pandemic, plague, or an illness alone does not bring people under control. It is not just that these diseases bring people under control. In the case of indigenous writers, in the case of the colonized population, in the case of the diaspora population, they say that they have already been plagued once, plagued by the colonial power, plagued by the indigenous population, talk about being plagued by the dominant power, the diaspora personalities by the host society, plagued by the host society, and the LGBTQ, the queer group, being plagued by those who call themselves normal. So all these are also kind of plagues that we come across, and many of them have made comparative study between the real plague and the contagion, as well as the kind of plague that has infected them. So, in fact, some of the indigenous writers say, we have already faced a plague, we are ready to face one more. So, metaphorically and literally, they have been saying. So, let us take a look at what they say. So, pandemics have obliterated the natives, literally and metaphorically, yet they have survived. So, the kind of pandemic that we are talking about is the contagion, the virus. So, virus has obliterated the natives, but they have survived. And Gappy Strong of the Native Indian Collective, is Native Indian Collective, he says, our whole systems of indigenous knowledge are being renewed and reclaimed for ecological renewal. So he says, our indigenous knowledge is most necessary for ecological renewal. The destruction of ecology, the destruction of the environment all around them is also a kind of plague that the indigenous population is most worried about. So apart from the plague, we are also so worried about the ecological destruction that's going on around them because of urbanization. And so they say their indigenous knowledge is being renewed mainly for ecological renewal. At the same time, indigenous knowledge, medical knowledge has also been renewed. For example, when we look at our own India, if you talk about just India, indigenous methods of medication, the Ayurveda and the Siddha, and if there are other indigenous native medicines, they have been called upon to help during the coronavirus pandemic. So the pandemic seems to have come under control or likely reported by many of the native medicines that have helped the population. While they did not have access to modern medical technologies, many of these native medicines generic to particular societies or particular cultures seem to have come to the help of rescue of the society. So, now this is also possible. We have already survived an apocalypse, says Rebecca Ron Horst, one another indigenous writer, the legacies of genocide and colonialism. So she talks about genocide and colonialism as a kind of pandemic, as a kind of plague. So they are ready to face the next. And they have actually become resilient, a kind of strong. People think we didn't survive. We did, and we are flourishing, says Darcy Little Badger. So she is also another indigenous writer. So these native Indian writers have professed their belief in their indigenous systems of knowledge, and they are ready and ever ready for any kind of plague or anything. So the counter effect that different things have on different kinds of people also has to be taken into consideration when we look at pandemic literature and the discourse of survival. So pandemic literature and diasporas. So when I speak about, I just mentioned the term diaspora, but let's see what else can be added to that. So desperate refugees are impacted by catastrophes. So when you look at the diaspora population, they have been impacted by catastrophes ranging from environmental disasters to the current COVID-19 pandemic. and it's also become global now. So it's not just one place, one particular diaspora, it's common throughout the world. So when we speak about diasporas, I think maybe I'll use the term liminal diaspora. So liminal diasporas are nothing but those diasporas who occupy the threshold space, the threshold area, and in between area, neither belonging to the host society nor belonging to their homeland. They populate a particular area. They are often found in the fringes of society where they are marginalized, they are ostracized, and they are called as minorities. So their status is always in a flux. Their status is ambiguous. Identity becomes their main crisis. So what happens in pandemic literature to them? They have not been identified. They neither belong to one particular place or the other. So where do they stand, and what is their status when it comes to the pandemics? How have they been depicted in pandemic literature? Let's take a look. Indigenous writers kind of belong to the liminal diaspora, but of course there is a difference. Now, when I talk about liminal spaces, we can always say they are in the in-between area, often called entre the in-betweenness, the liminal space. They occupy the liminal space. Now, women, the diaspora population, the disabled, the refugee camps, refugee literature, the refugees, the plantation workers, the indentured laborers, and the ethnic minorities. All of them kind of form a part of this liminal diaspora. All of them have undergone human rights violation, and all of their conditions has exponentially magnified in the era of COVID-19. So because of COVID-19, all their conditions have been magnified to a very high level. Maybe I don't know if we can use the word tragedy. Their status that was constantly in flux. They were trying to identify themselves. They were struggling for an identity. This particular strife has been exacerbated to a very high level. So what do the LGBTs say in the discourse of survival? We have a list of LGBT queer writers. Parvathy Sharma, she's the author of the queer short story collection, The Dead Camel and Other Stories of Love. So she says the creative potential is very much live, and it is especially so for the queer community who would like to produce more, who would like to express themselves better. The poet activist Rohan Matthews once again identifies himself with the queer population. He has also said that the pandemic situation has allowed him, has given him space to understand people, has given him space to think, and he is also ready with more work of art, expressing his own experiences. Manish Gaikwad, the author of the queer novel Lean Days, published in 2018, he is now ready, and he is ready with the story of his mother's life, and he would also like to find expression of a queer romance set in the film industry. So Manish Gaikwad's efforts are also slowly taking shape. I'm talking about all the queer writers from India, and we have Payal Dar, who wrote the queer novel Slightly Burnt in 2014. And Payal Dar talks about, is very particular about the suicidal instincts that has become very prominent in amidst the queer community, especially with the lockdown and all the loneliness. So she gives importance to this, and she also talks about one of her friends, a bisexual woman who committed suicide because of all this the mental illness. So she says all these things have to be made into literature so that people become aware of what is happening for the queer community. So we have Shahil author of the queer novel A Thousand Dreams Within Me Softly Born 2017, where he's ready with he's next ready with a supernatural fantasy novel to find out if a man is dead or alive. So we have a lot of writers coming up with new works. So probably the end of pandemics is going to see a huge amount of contribution from the queer writers too. So next we have Keki Ranade, whose last book was Growing Up Gay in Urban India in 2018. So we have Aruni Kashyap, his father's disease, published in 2019. Teaches creative writing in the University of Georgia. He says he was totally destroyed by his brother's death because of COVID. His brother was a victim of COVID. Now living a very lonely life because of the lockdown and all that, he's being unable to socialize. He has been collecting short stories of queer writers from India. Short stories of queer writers, which he plans to teach to his students. So the amount of literary productions, the amount of creative writing is slowly gathering pace, and like many writers who are looking forward for a great number of writings to come up. We are going to, I'm sure, much, especially from the different walks of society, different orientations, different writings are going to flood the market. In fact, we have The Gun Island of 2019 by Amitav Ghosh. Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island, published in 2019. So he, in that particular novel, talks about climate changes. So climate change is closely associated with environmental literature, and he talks about the maladies of climate change, what kind of transformations climate change has brought about on a society. So he, while talking about that, he says, this lockdown is going to be a perfect period, and soon after the lockdown, the literary world can look forward to a lot of production. So, and I think Arundhati Roy also has prophesied a lot of literary production soon after the lockdown. Now moving on to the next slide. So what is, we have been looking at different kinds of writing, different literary forms and pandemic writing. So what is most specific about all of them is the existential dilemma that has been presented in all these writings. So when I speak about existential dilemma, I'm talking about, we can look at Camus. Camus' The Plague is an important text that we have already seen, which voices the existential delirium. Now, and Samuel Beckett's contribution to this existential mania in Waiting for Godot actually is a reflection of the present condition. We are, the entire population, the humankind is not very sure about what it is waiting for. Almost all of us are waiting for a closure. The closure is not around the corner. We expect that all this will come to an end in a few months' time, but I think we've been expecting a closure from 2019 onwards. We took enough time to grapple with the fact that we have been affected by, we have been attacked by a pandemic of global scale. So, but after that, I think everyone was busy with the tragedies, trying to save ourselves and all that. But the waiting has become unending, like Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Meaningless, absurd, and permanent. And the existential dilemma of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland is kind of reflected in today's society. So that's why a mention of these writers, especially existential writers. So T.S. Eliot's idea of the wasteland, the present day world is once again a kind of wasteland that we find. Of course, Catherine A. Porter's existentialism we find in Pale Horse Pale Rider, I think I've already spoken about that. So this kind of existential presence, the existential livelihood that we are undergoing now, or we have been forced to undergo, has quite often made a lot of changes psychologically, socially, and in an individual also. Now, coming to pandemic literature, a discourse of survival, I would say that storytelling, the act of storytelling itself is a method of survival. Storytelling as survival is what we find in the Boccaccio's Decameron. So all young men and women gathered together, all self-isolated, they try to tell stories to while away their time, to keep themselves away from the tragedy that is happening in the outside. It is also kind of similar to the pilgrim's process. The plethora of stories that came out of all those pilgrims, some startlingly moral, some startlingly immoral. Despite all that, the pilgrim's progress went on. It was a progress. And so is Boccaccio's Decameron. Now, storytelling should be a kind of responsible storytelling. So what is responsible storytelling? Telling facts. Of course, we need some amount of fantasy, but responsible storytelling is what is associated with pandemic literature. And the reader should be engaged imaginatively as well as intellectually and emotionally through storytelling. So, imaginatively, it will provide them some respite from the tragedy that they are undergoing now. Intellectually, so that it brings them back to their senses and shows them what is logically right and wrong. And this storytelling has the power to realize imagination, making imagination true. One day this imagination will become true and make life meaningful amidst all the chaos and the turmoil brought down by the pandemic. This storytelling also is therapeutic in nature. It is actually cathartic in nature. It helps one purge themselves of all the feeling of tragedy, the feeling of horror, the existential mindset. One can be purged of the existential mindset by this kind of storytelling. It helps one to build a narrative whereby one can overcome the destabilization caused by the disease. The disease has not just affected us, it has destabilized our normalcy. It has sometimes destabilized our entire psyche. The contagion or the illness is actually a symptom of something different and more profound than the actual disease. So this kind of disease actually questions our sanity. So to stay in a very canny environment, we'll have to do this storytelling as a kind of therapy. Storytelling contains the terror caused by the widespread illness. Many people have been trying to keep themselves away. A kind of escapism is being practiced so that they'll keep themselves away. I think after almost 2 years of time, most of the public has come to believe, keep yourself away from too much media information. This media can feed in, not that media gives always false information, but many of us have kind of come to a conclusion that media has to be kept at bay at one point of time, because storytelling becomes the first response to helplessness. So if you feel helpless, if you want to tell a story, create your own story. So pandemic literature is a resultant of this kind of storytelling. Denial is another aspect that is most common in pandemic literature. So the first step is accepting that there is a, understanding or being aware that there is a contagion at large that is infecting us, but denying the fact that it can affect us. So that is the initial reaction that all of us have. So the common feature in every contagion situation is not the virus, but human beings as a response to the tragedy. So the virus is different. Each time you find that the virus is different, but what is same is the human beings' response to the tragedy. We have seen different kinds of virus through the course of this lecture. But how do people respond? So people respond in a similar way. People have responded stubbornly. People have responded courageously. People have responded with a lot of resilience, that they have become survivors. most of the people are have success stories to say after the attack of the plague. So once the pandemic situation is over, we'll have a lot of recorded facts about the pandemic. We'll have stories of heroism. We'll have a lot of heroes walking the streets. So the virus is different, but the response that human beings give to that is the same. So denial of facts is usually done mainly by the society, individuals, and governments because of their fear of the contagion. The threat of contagion makes them deny facts. So denial of facts is a permanent aspect from the days of the Spanish flu. So misinformation, wrong information, data is not recorded properly. Right. There is also a distortion of numbers and the propensity of suffering. 2.5 million people only died. That was what the Spanish flu authorities of that particular period said. But it was 100 million globally. Manipulation of data. My place is coronavirus free. If a leader says that, then there is a problem. It's manipulation of data. This contagion has spread its wings everywhere. So we should take everything with a pinch of salt. And one more important aspect is stigmatization of victims. This is an important aspect that has human rights. It's actually human rights violation. So if you call a particular country, a particular person, or a particular culture as responsible for the spread of virus, then it's stigmatization of those victims. So no one deliberately spreads. A virus spreads by itself. It has an idea, it has a plan of its own, probably. So if one of the countries, the most powerful country of the world, can call the virus as Chinese virus, it should also remember that the Spanish flu, as the ground zero for Spanish flu, was that particular country. And social exclusion of victims is another thing. Lots of advertisements have come up. Please don't exclude the virus, not the victim. So social exclusion of entire families, social exclusion of individuals in fear of the virus, in retaliation to the mortality rates, in retaliation to the mortality in news that we get, is not right, is ethically not right. So it should be a social distancing, but not social exclusion. Social distancing and social exclusion are totally different from each other. And the blame game or name calling also should stop. So many people of Asian ethnicity, Asian race, were ostracized for being Asian because of the in the beginning stages of coronavirus outbreak. So why would someone living totally away from China be responsible for that? So just because someone called it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus doesn't mean anyone with Chinese of Chinese descent will be the carrier of that particular virus. So this particular kind of epidemic is called infodemics. So so the wrong information, manipulation of data, distortion of numbers, all that spreading far and wide is called infodemics. So the stigma, let's almost at the end of it, the stigma that is attached to this particular kind of illness narratives, it has to be avoided. The episodes of racism and xenophobia, the stigma that the COVID pandemic victims underwent can be looked at now. The episodes of racism and xenophobia that occurred in Italy and other Western countries. So people of Chinese origin were attacked. So racism and xenophobia, they were called names. They were called as carriers of the particular strain, coronavirus strain. And ostracizing individuals with Asian traits also happened, even in India. India, not people of just Chinese origin or Chinese descent, even people from Nagaland and other places, those were in the initial stages of the pandemic outbreak. They were called as, they had such traits that they were called as carriers of the coronavirus. So that was wrong. This kind of ostracizing is not right. and the tendency to pathologize a place along with its population and culture. So cordoning of China and Chinese population is not going to stop the spread of virus. Now the virus is everywhere else. Will anyone take responsible for its spread? Will anyone else take responsibility? So why would you make someone responsible for pathologize someone for the spread of a virus? The Chinese virus, calling it the Wuhan flu, which is not right. In fact, syphilis was first called as the French disease. This is also, so it did not have origins in France, but it was called a French disease. Of course, in Crime and Punishment, we have something called the mysterious Asian fever. There's a fever, and that's called the Asian fever. So this kind of stigmatizing was prevalent in history, and a few of them have been mentioned. In fact, Susan Sontag is a great case study when it comes to pandemic literature and illness narrative. She says nothing is more creative than to give a disease a meaning. So the disease is less dreadful than than giving a meaning to a disease. So coronavirus is bad. The disease is not right. The disease is horrible. But calling Chinese or calling Chinese responsible for the disease is not right. So nothing is more damaging than to give a disease a meaning, giving a disease a meaning. An alternative mutual, so what can be done to overcome this? What can be done to do something better? An alternative, provide an alternative, a mutual understanding, making peace with the uncanny. We are not unable to understand the fact, understand the virus, understand its effects. Try to make peace with the uncanny, keeping oneself better informed. So better information is more relevant and more immediate requirement now than lot of information. So too much information is also unnecessary now. So how does pandemic literature become a discourse of survival? So the actual diseases, in fact, Susan Sontag's another quotation is of great help here. The metaphors and myths I was convinced kill. Susan Sontag says, a survivor of cancer, she says, the disease does not kill a person, but the metaphors and myths and the misunderstandings associated with the disease, I was convinced would kill a person, Susan Sontag says. So actual diseases are in fact less harmful than the cultural discourse surrounding them. So this is what Susan Sontag says. So she says, let us be a little more sympathetic towards the people who are being victimized because of a particular disease, by the misunderstanding of others, not by the disease. Right. The major thrust of writing on the metaphor and above all myths of illness is to save lives. So why do we write? It's to save lives. It's to help people get a better understanding of a particular incident, of a particular power that is very dominant in the society now. Writing to get rid of the language of stigma and the shame and burden associated with them and the negativity apportioned to them. So to write is to undergo a therapy. It has a cathartic effect, as I told earlier. It is to purge oneself of the or purge someone else of the shame and burden associated with them and the negativity apportioned to them. So writing should have a kind of therapeutic effect. So that's most important. Pandemic literature does that. Pandemic literature has clarified many aspects associated with illness, associated with disabilities, and with the plague-stricken populations. Main agenda of the pandemic literature is to shift the focus from acquiring of the disease to the actual malady. So if you're going to give more importance to from where did the disease come, who was the beginner, who was the first person to be affected by the disease, you're going to lose the main focus. So a writer's agenda should be not the acquiring of the disease, but the actual disease. It helps in understanding the reality of the disease. It's going to be more beneficial than trying to find the origin of the disease. So the disease is here, the disease has come to stay. So, trying to find a way out of the disease is far better than trying to find its origin and try to blame someone. And this kind of writing may spare the already stricken, already affected individual from suffering a social death before a physical one. So, because of stigmatizing, people undergo social death before physical death. So, instead of this applies to a particular race, class, or even coronavirus victims. So, rather than ostracizing them, rather than killing them socially first and then waiting for them to die physically, try to be sympathetic, try to be more understanding. All this understanding and sympathy can come from literatures. Empathizing with the coronavirus victim can happen by better understanding of the situation, the reality. So once again, the discourse of survival, storytelling and plot construction makes sense of illness and health. It is not giving you a clarity. It tries to make sense of the illness, the contagion. It helps in building meaningful totalities out of scattered events and phenomena. Everyone were shocked by the coronavirus pandemic. They were not first affected. First, the entire population was shocked. And shortly after, when they started understanding it gradually, they came to find a meaningful totality out of all the chaos. So, literature, pandemic literature will also help you find a meaning out of all the chaos that happens in the society. Pandemic discourse is committed to bring meaning out of the pain and sorrow. The pain and sorrow can never be separated. It will stay forever, but meaning, creating a meaning out of it, finding a meaning out of all that, and trying to form a better future is what is most important for human beings. Every person born into the world has a natural right to sustain, preserve, and defend their own life. So let's not stigmatize coronavirus victims, people who are afflicted by this disease. Storytelling becomes its own palliative, it becomes its own medicine to drown out suffering and loss. And narrative can preserve and remake the world as it falls apart. The world falling apart cannot be stopped, but of course you can certainly grab help from writing, grab help from narratives, and try to rebuild soon after the pandemic is over. And the pandemic is not a permanent one. The pandemic is temporary. The pandemic is going to end shortly, and then trying to rebuild out of the broken twigs would be the best thing that human society can do. As the world tries to reconstruct itself, such literature of survival remind them of their continuity with the past, from which they have been severed. So now we are in a space of severance. We have been separated from certain realities, the best times of life, but it's temporary. Shortly there will be a change. That transformation should be supported by meaningful understandings of the pandemic and the course that it has written. So, Mike Chen's novel, the recent novel of Mike Chen that we had just taken a look at, has been commented upon by Peng Shepherd in this way. So Peng Shepherd says, not just an apocalyptic thriller, Mike Chen's novel is not just an apocalyptic thriller, but also a timely reminder of what is most important in life, that is family, love, and hope. So, to survive, you don't need the best, the best of money. You don't need the best of times. To survive, you need hope. And for hope to stay within you, you need a family and love. And Peng Shepherd has rightly put it at the right time. He says, the most important things in life is not the success stories we often hear, but in today's world, we find that family, love, and hope are most important for any human being to survive. So, with the help of writing, with the help of the pandemic literature that we have seen, let's find, or let's go back to our roots, searching for a family, love, and hope, and thereby overcome this particular pandemic. Thank you. There is a short reading. For the reading, I think you can take a look at it. So that's it.
Hello?
Yeah,
Hello?
hello.
Yes, ma'am. Is it over?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you so much for explaining all the concepts of pandemic literature succinctly and lucidly. Really, it was useful and informative, and thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And this is a time for question and interactions. The participants can raise the questions if you are interested, or if you want to ask any question. This is your time, your turn. You can do it. Questions are welcome. Participants, you are requested to raise questions regarding the title and the lecture also.
Ma'am, there is a question which was asked by Muvendan sir. He's from
Yes.
Andhra College. Can you
Okay.
throw light on any Indian works on pandemic?
Yeah,
Can you
sure.
throw light on any Indian works on pandemic?
Yeah, the question is clear. Thank you, Dr. Muvendan, for the question. I deliberately I left out this particular thing, Indian English writing and the pandemic literature. So I was impressed by this one particular text. I think most of us will be familiar with it. There are several texts, but most impressive of all is Amitav Ghosh's the Calcutta Chromosome. I think most of you must be familiar with this. So the Calcutta Chromosome throws light on a kind of plague, the malaria infection, and the search for a kind of relief out of it, the variants, the strains, and all that. So that is a kind of scientific fiction that has been very impressive. And of course, there are other texts also which I have not mentioned. And one thing is, pandemic literature in Indian writing in English can serve a separate study all by itself. So I think we'll have to wait for that.
Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am, and my name is Tirnav Guruse. I am working as an English teacher in Parvathy's College.
Yes, sir.
And
Yes, sir.
I have a question to ask you. Pandemic fiction, when you display the slide number 9 under the title Pandemic Fiction, and you have chronologically ordered all the literary works which have the pandemic elements.
Okay.
And on seeing or on hearing these things, and there was a question: how did you find out these elements? And I think you have showed or you have referred many ancient works like Homer's Iliad and Boccaccio's Decameron and Mary Shelley, The Lost Man. And how did you read these literary texts, and how did you find out these pandemic elements? And it was really amazing, astounding to see. And in this pandemic situation, and there are many contemporary works, as you mentioned in the slides. And how did you find out, and what made you analyze these literary works, especially these ancient literary works? What is the impulse?
Okay. The first impulse was the head of the department of English of Parvathy's Arts and Science College. Okay, right. So next is this. Here, pandemic literature, the pandemics are more in number and are very ancient. They are not new. So any work of art is the duty of any work of art, writers of the time, is to exhibit or is to reflect the society in truth. So pandemic had when you see pandemic in today's situation, it has transformed our lives. It has had a lasting effect on many people's lives. So in this case, I'm sure pandemics in those days of less medical technology was not strong. And at the same time, other knowledge dissemination was also a little as slower. In that condition, I'm sure there must have been some amount of pandemic literature with the basis of those plagues and epidemics. So that's how I started looking into them. And especially the idea of survival was most hopeful. I think the idea of survival is most imminent and required in this today's situation. So that's how I started reading into it and took a look at all of them and formed a list of it.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Next question. Does anybody want to raise? Next question. Is there any question? Next
Yes,
question.
most more questions are there.
Hello,
Ma'am,
ma'am.
what is the common psychic state of the characters in the pandemic fiction who are living in pandemic time?
Ma'am, your question was not clear to me. Can you repeat it?
State of the characters in the pandemic fiction who are living in pandemic time.
The characters in the pandemic situation who are living in the pandemic time. Can you repeat the first part of your question? That alone is not audible.
Ma'am, what is
Yeah, your voice is so
ma'am?
low, Bilda, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm here.
Good noon, ma'am. This is
Yeah.
Radha, ma'am. My question is, ma'am, you listed a lot of works, ma'am, fictional works. So in that, you may have characters who are living in that time, pandemic time, who are facing this frustration and all that. So my question is, what are the common what are the common psychic features all these characters have, ma'am? நிறைய fiction இருக்கு. So what are the common psychic characteristics they have, ma'am? Is that
Psychic features?
Yes,
Do you
ma'am,
mean psychic features? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So,
frustration, hope, like that, ma'am.
Okay. So one common aspect is desolation. One common aspect is desolation. And I think there is a lot of literature, a lot of texts have provided insights into the sorrow, the pain, and the loss that these characters have suffered. But I, for my study, have taken up only those texts where the instinct for survival has been stronger than the loss that they have suffered. Okay? So desolation was one important thing, that almost all the despair, doubts, skeptical in nature. These are the important features that psychic features, if I can call it in your way. Most of the characters have suffered, but for my study, I concentrated on those who survived, those survival tales. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Hello,
ma'am.
good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah,
I got it, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving a wonderful session on untouched topic. And my question is, are there any subdivision under the umbrella term pandemic literature for the scope to do research?
That's a great question, Mr. Mohan Bharti, if I think so. So there you have an enviably huge amount of literature, amount of literary productions to help start a research in pandemic literature. And one more thing is, it's going to be a lot of homework if you're going to start research in pandemic literature. This is for every student here and researcher here, because shortly after the pandemic, which is sure to end towards the end of this year, you are going to witness a plethora of literary writings based on pandemic and pandemic situation, all first-hand information directly from the victims or first-hand witnesses. So the umbrella term pandemic literature, rightly put by you, covers maybe something like this: illness narrative, outbreak narratives, disability narratives, trauma narratives, and pathological, trauma criticism. I think all of them come under this. It's a huge
psychological
arena.
trauma.
Yes.
The psychological trauma that you have mentioned, the terms comes.
Yes, of course. When I say it's trauma, actually trauma criticism concentrates more on psychological criticism. It's not the physical pain and all that, but still psychological pain and psychological suffering is part of, because pandemic is not just a disease. An illness is not a chronic illness, is not just a disease. We are talking about chronic illness. We are not talking about common illness that we face. So psychological aberration is a must, and will be a very significant quality of this kind of knowledge. So psychological trauma is an important aspect of this. You have a lot of room for reading. We have a lot of text for criticizing. A lot of critical schools back pandemic literature. Indigenous lives and literature, feminist criticism, and disability narratives, ableism. I think all of you know what ableism is. So ableism and all of them are going to jump into the help for understanding pandemic literature.
Ma'am, one more question. Participant asked a question that, can you please suggest some theories to analyze to do research on the pandemic literature? Can you please suggest some theories to analyze to do research on the pandemic literature?
Okay, critical theories. Okay, so when we talk about critical theories closely related to pandemic literature, or that will be that can pair up easily with this kind of study, we can look at trauma theory. We can look at, in fact, postmodern theory is also one important thing. Postmodern theory, existential theory, and disability studies, all of them together can back pandemic literature. You can make a reading out of all these theories. You use these theories and then make a reading. And when you go to indigenous, extreme environmentalism is another important aspect. Ecological criticism, eco-criticism. The ecology has also improved in a way because of the pandemic lockdowns. So different kinds of outlooks are possible with all these critical theories in pandemic literature. Thank you. Any other questions?
No, ma'am. There is no questions.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm not removing them. You have made a very comprehensive and wonderful presentation, ma'am. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure listening to your lecture. Thank you.
Sure, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir Anandan, sir. HOD, sir. Hello.
Sir?
Sir, shall we move on?
Okay, sir. You go to the next step.
Okay, sir.
Okay, yes.
1 second, sir. Sir, any other question? Is it over? Okay. And this one-day national webinar on the title Pandemic Literature, a Discourse on Survival, has come to an end, and this is time to express our gratitude to those who took efforts to organize and conduct this webinar in a peaceful and meaningful way. And I request Dr. P. Anandan, Head Department of English, to preface the vote of thanks on behalf of everyone.
Good afternoon to all. Most honored Chairman, respected Secretary, learned Director, Academic Principal, beloved Vice Principal, the great orator of the day, the resource person, Dr. Pamela Jayaraju, dear heads of various department, colleagues, and my dear literary participants. I am very delightful to be called upon to propose the vote of thanks on this wonderful occasion. This webinar helps us to develop a critical eye on pandemic literature and mentally prepare to overcome the pandemic. The literary study on the pandemic has proven that it is a temporary one. Through Newton's third law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. As far as the seminar concerned, in social distance, the word distance should be distanced in the forthcoming days of a human life for a social. As well as we are the person to make a lockdown to the lockdown. As a literary people, we have an imaginary thread to connect all the pandemics, and we have to put in a particular room in the world. So the session is very wonderful and informative. Thank you for all the participants. It's my pleasure to offer my sincere thanks to the management of PARVATHY'S Arts and Science College, the philanthropist, Mr. S. Srinivasan, Chairman, the humanitarian, Mr. S. Sridhar, Secretary, and the young director, Mr. S. Praveen, for their kind support and readiness in accepting to conduct this webinar in our premises. Thank you, sirs. It's my duty to express my gratitude to the chief guest, the great orator, Dr. Pamela Jayaraju, head of the Department of English, Perundalaiva Kamarajar Arts College, Pondicherry, for her meaningful oration is a useful one in this pandemic scenario. Your brilliant speech was decorated with the sensible wisdom, subtle humor, and a sober sense of optimism. It was surely informative, inspiring, and interesting. Once again, you have proven you are the daughter of the legend and tribute, Dr. M.A.J. They are the boss of us. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for your accepting and deliver your wonderful session through this virtual meet. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Anandan. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Okay.
It's so interesting to listen to the questions and give answers also. Thanks to all the participants and all the faculty who are here.